tools out there to help with managing and maintaining projects. But I'm going to talk about the squishy stuff. I'm going to talk about what you need to do to deal with the humans inside of it. I might mention some tools here and there, but it really is about dealing with the humans and how to be successful in maintaining your projects in open source and also be an open source leader. So the reason why this is the third slide is because it's actually one of the most important things you should do. Um, Scoping your project is unbelievably valuable for when it comes to um, open source. There's two different stories I like to tell here. First is something called OpenStack. So if you didn't know, there's a project out there called OpenStack, which was originally created to be the open source cloud operating system. It was basically the open source version of AWS. And for the longest time, OpenStack had this interesting ecosystem around it. And then eventually they created something called the Big Tent. And the problem with the Big Tent was that it allowed anyone to build an OpenStack project. Now, this was right at the heyday of OpenStack, and the irony is that because anyone could create a project inside of OpenStack, that means anyone could create a project inside of OpenStack. And we discovered that there were companies out there who actually gave um, uh, promotions and monetary rewards for starting projects inside of OpenStack. So before you know it, the scope of the actual OpenStack project became so large that it was no longer uh, feasible. It was very interesting. The the challenge being with all these different companies coming together with that. Anyway, I'm so sorry. I'm very sleepy right now. um, on the flip side of the scoping of the project, the very first project I was ever involved in was something called CRUX, which was a small Linux distribution. Even though as an operating system, you imagine to be so massive and um, so hard to put together, because of the way uh, the team at CRUX worked and knew exactly what they needed to do. They were able to work together to make sure things were successful. So scoping your project is the very first thing you need to understand and really grasp with when it comes to open source. So there's two main buckets when it comes to a project, and the first one is personally backed. And from what I've learned, this is actually the majority of projects out there. When you look at anything on GitHub, most of the time it is some person or someone who's come together, have decided that they have some scratch they need to itch, and they release it to GitHub or GitLab or whatever. And the largest challenge with this is that it's your baby, right? And it's scratching your itch. And the reason why this is a challenge is because you are that leader at that project. You do have the full responsibility of it. It's a double-edged sword where all of a sudden you are the end all be all. You have to make the decisions. You take the full responsibility. And it can be very stressful. There's some projects out there that people have that they get wrapped up inside of it as part of their personality. And it's amazingly challenging. On the other side, there's corporate back projects. Corporate back projects are most likely the majority of people I'm talking to right now uh, have some level of interaction with corporation that makes the decisions for the project. I had the privilege of seeing how Chef Software moved from a personally backed project into a true corporate backed project. And it is a privilege to be able to work on a project like that because you're getting paid to do open source work. It's a position of privilege, but at the same time, you have to deal with whatever the corporation wants. So instead of being personally backed, where your personality may really want something to go one way, the corporation will come along and say, no, 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 we need to do it the other way. It's it can be frustrating, especially if you start the project. Remember, we're using computers to make our lives better, and sometimes the corporations don't always have that in mind. Think of projects that we all love and adore, like, Google Reader. I still make a reference to that. Even though it wasn't open sourced, it's still, just one of those projects that Google decided to shut down. Or for that matter, Oracle coming along and buying up all the different projects out there from the open source communities. You have to think about it for a little while and realize that not always do corporations have the best interest of the users in mind, or they do, and they're just trying to do it in a way that we don't fully understand. By the way, if you have any questions or thoughts, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. I am watching it while I'm doing the presentation here too. The next step and the next thing you need to really truly understand is the empathy for your audience. Believe it or not, as a leader in the open source ecosystem or a maintainer, you're a performer and a seller almost all the time. You're constantly recruiting and always have to be on brand for your project. This doesn't always happen overnight. It can take months or years of dead silence or a trickle of engagement. Uh, and if you're lucky, then you get to create a community. The scary thing is it is because it's all volunteers that want to help you. You have to continually cultivate it. If you do something wrong in your project, you can lose all your members overnight. Now, if you take a moment to think about that, if you've ever tried to start a meetup, it's the exact same thing. When we were allowed to actually go to like coffee shops and restaurants or or, or parks or whatever to have meetups for our ecosystem, it's the same way. You could start a meetup in your local town. You might have 10 people show up the first time or the first month. The second month you might have 5, and then by month 3 you might have two people or not even that. And and then all of a sudden a month later you might have 7 people show up. It's the same thing with open source software. The waves and the ebbs and flows of what goes on is hard, and you have to continually cultivate that. And if you make a mistake, hopefully your community will respect you and not completely abandon you, but because they're volunteers that they're just going to go around. It doesn't have to sound um it can take months or years to build your community for your open source project, but it can all disappear overnight. It doesn't sound like all rainbows and unicorns because it isn't. It's really hard and unforgiving. It's frustrating, and you have to understand that people are coming as volunteer. So I'm not going to read this because I know y'all can read, but the interesting story here is I was writing up an uh, I was I was answering some questions about a big corporation who wanted to open source a project once, and they literally said, "Hey JJ, don't I just need to throw the software on GitHub and spin up a wiki and I'm done? Like the nerds will come and start doing the work for me." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And the funny story was, is as I was saying these words to him, I was looking out my window and there was a park and I saw a bunch of people picking up trash. And all of a sudden I realized, at least in Texas, open source building an open source community is a lot like trying to set up a trash pickup. So in Texas, normally, not right now, but normally, it's very, very hot. And one of the challenges with trash pickups is that you can't just put up a sign and say, "Hey, come help clean up the park today." You actually have to work with a bunch of people and logistics around it. You've got to set up how to set up the trash bags, where people can get water or drop off the trash, or for that matter, how the different people are going to communicate, and you know, all these really interesting things. If it's large enough, if you need to get porta potties, there's many different things to do here. And all of a sudden I realized that there was a lot of logistics involved. And if you work for this corporation that he was talking about all this work he had to do to get it done. And I realized that it's not like nobody cares about that. It's just like the trash pickup. People are there to pick up trash. They don't care about the logistics if they deal with the city. And it was a really interesting parallel. If you're curious, please don't hesitate to ping me. I actually have the full blog post about what this whole story is, and I can send it to you. So it's interesting. You got to think about it and realize that as a leader, a lot of the times people don't care about how what you have to deal with to keep the project alive. The next thing you need to worry about, or the next thing you need to not worry about, but actually engage in, are celebrations. You need to celebrate everything and anything. You need to constantly work with your team to make sure, or the community that you're working with, to celebrate anything ranging from release one to someone who just was promoted from a user to a maintainer. You need to celebrate these things from the mountaintops. You need to scream and shout to make sure everybody realizes that you are thankful for them to be working with you on this project. Celebrations are hard, believe it or not, because you start feeling like all of a sudden it feels like it's too much. But never forget, nothing's too small to celebrate. Take any and all the wins you can have, because when you celebrate, it feeds itself because people get engaged. They realize that things are going on. And as they say, positivity brings more positivity, which brings more positivity. So celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. But on the flip side, you need to acknowledge your defeats. If things break, I mean, it's an open source project. Of course, those things are going to break on you. Things are going to go off the rails, and you need to own it. Do not hide the problems that you have. You need to acknowledge the defeats because you never know who is using your project downstream. If you're writing a library, who knows who's using that software to do stuff? And it could be mission critical that you found a bug there that all of a sudden two or three other projects might be fully affected. So you need to have the transparency of those problems and the defeats. You'll never gain the traction you want if you keep this stuff hidden behind a mailing list or something that else is a little bit harder to get to. So one of the challenges is that also with in the sense of defeats is that communities can be draining too. Like as a maintainer, you'll be you can be completely drained from the negativity in the community also. I mean, we all know the different situations where open source goes wrong, and I'm not going to highlight him here, but just remember, as a leader of the project, you have to acknowledge and understand these things. So keep that in mind. So we've talked about a few little high level concepts that, believe it or not, are really hard to really express and talk about. Let's actually talk about some very tangible, successful traits of open source projects to make sure that as long as you can walk away from this talk, you at least have something to grasp onto and move forward. And I love this first one because it's so obvious, but at the same time, it's very hard to do. The first trait you have to have is trust. Like as obvious as it sounds, you have to trust that your community will do the right thing. You have to default to trust as an open source maintainer or project or leader. That's the only way things are going to work. You'd be amazed at how many people want to just open source their software and just put it on GitHub, but never merge anything in. It's almost like it's a show horse. That they're just trying to, or show pony. They just want to show off how cool they are or what they can do, but they never want to take a pull request or a merge request. But if you're trying to build a community, you have to trust that the people are going to do something with it, and who knows what they're going to do with it. And that's part of the fun. But by releasing your code into the world, you have to trust that many hands will make light work, and you have to still constantly recruit to bring people into it. So remember, trust is one of the first things you've got to do. And if you're not a trustworthy person, open source maintainership and open source creation or leadership might not be a great place for you because again, you have to trust your community to do the right thing. The next thing is accessibility. This isn't just accessing the project. This is actually how the community can come together. I'm going to take OpenStack again as an example, and there was an interesting kind of conversion that happened when I was really involved in the OpenStack-Chef project, which was originally when OpenStack-Chef started, they did everything through Google Meet. So when it was before it became part of the big tent and a official, I'm putting that in air quotes, OpenStack project, everything we jumped on Google Meet to have at that time face-to-face conversations to be able to talk about the week's goals for the project. And it was a weekly meeting every Monday. Everybody knew when it was. But at the time, we never realized that we were actually putting up a blocker for our friends in China, because it turns out an OpenStack Chef was actually being used extensively in China at the time. I believe actually IBM was using it, which is kind of ironic when you think about it, because I work at IBM now. It's not. I don't work on OpenStack Chef. It's just funny how it works that way. And so as we moved into the Big Ten or became an official project, they told us we had to move to IRC. So all of a sudden, from the face-to-face meetings, we moved to text-based. But as a Westerner, as a Texan, and as an American, I forget that people know more than one language, right? Like I think everybody speaks in English. It's one of my biases. But all of a sudden, as we moved to IRC, that allowed people to start speaking asynchronously. When we had our meeting time to actually talk about things, we were able to get so many more people engaged with us because first of all, IRC at the time wasn't blocked in China, or was less blocked, I should say. And we were able to get people from all walks of life to be able to actually speak it. Well, we spoke in English, but they were able to communicate at the pace that they needed to, which engaged so many interesting ways and awesome things to happen. So just that one little switch from Google Meet to IRC all of a sudden opened up the accessibility to the project. I mean, okay, nowadays we might use Slack or whatever as that same offering. I mean, the open source purist in me, I mean, you don't actually own the servers that IRC or Slack works, and there's payments and all that jazz. But at the same time, Slack is pretty much white. What's the word? Allow listed across every corporation now. So you might still be able to get other people involved, but you kind of get the point, right? Where the idea is that take a moment and think about the different ways your project is going to be out there and how accessible it is to engage with that community. Just to make sure I'm not talking to just a wall. Can someone do a plus one or wave me a hi in the chat to make sure that I'm actually coming through? Ah, perfect. Thank you, Frank. Thank you. But and also, if you have any questions, uh, don't hesitate to put them in the chat as I am watching it. So the next successful trait is truly a clear vision. Um, and this is a weird way to say it, but you need to have a plan to move on. Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. You have to have a plan to move on if needed. Eventually, you're going to get bored, right? Like you're not the project you're working on is not going to be the thing you're going to do for the rest of your life. You're going to do something else. So you're going to have to move on, and don't lie. You will. As an engineer or a developer, you most likely have the trait that you're a constant learner. Your project will get stale and crusty, and possibly even a burden. Some say this is a win, but others get jaded and want to move on. But you can't just leave your project behind. You need a way to, because if you have a clear vision of the goals, you should be able to hand it off to someone else. You'll need someone or someone's to take up those reins. So yes, have an exit strategy. You need to be with a clear vision. You can hand your project off to someone else and they can run with it. And hopefully you can move on in such a constructive way that you might be able to come back come back and help in one day. Or for that matter, because you're such a great leader or a maintainer or someone along that, some of those people might come along with you in the project. I've actually had people that I've worked with on open source projects who I've been able to either get hired at a company or work with because I know they're so great. And it's amazing. Like you build a community. Oh, interesting, Frank. Frank was just said that he was thinking about how to apply this to the inner source projects inside the company. All of these things work exactly with that same thing. This is just really awesome traits about how to build a community in general. So I went through this a little bit quicker than I was expecting, and mainly because, as I was saying at the very beginning, it's very early in the morning, and I have had no caffeine, and because I have to go back to sleep because again, it's very early in the morning. But I do hope you understand that, having a handful of these traits and moving forward, it's very important. But the one last final question I have is, as a person walking into this world or been part of this world, honestly, is it even really worth this hassle? With the audience whom I'm speaking with, and if you come to this talk, you're probably you have some level of debate in your head. Most people who involve themselves inside of the open source communities want to be a leader of some point, or they have opinions, and that's perfect. That's wonderful. I'm not knocking it. That's we need more. We need more opinions in our communities, or we need to build more communities. You probably want to do or run an open source project, and maybe I hit a couple chords when you thought about these things, just like Frank mentioned about his inner source projects inside his company. I know this struggle day in and day out because personally I deal with it, right? Because that's part of my job. I have a privilege of working in open source, getting paid to work in open source, even better. And I have to realize like where do I want to put my time and effort into? So I struggle with this day in and day out. You have to balance these demands of your corporate leaders, and you have to also balance the demands to your community. Like, I've had some relatively rough times dealing with and having to, um, what's a good word for it? Balance what my corporation wanted at the time and what my community was like. Why would I ever do it this way? This is dumb, JJ. Well, I want to do it this way. I'm thinking of something that happened with OpenStack and VMware and Chef at that time. And I had to go. I ended up going on the side of the community, even though I know I got some mucky mucks up on high inside the corporation very angry at me. So honestly, is it really worth the hassle? It depends, right? Like, I don't know. And that's the kind of the joke of the whole thing is that it's a personal choice. If any of these things resonate with you, then maybe it is. But the best thing to do is just to be engaged in your community and continue engaging. And who knows, maybe you'll get promoted and you'll get to celebrate. Or for that matter, you might find something that scratches your own itch. And who knows, you might be able to leverage it somewhere else. And who also, maybe in a year's time, maybe in 2 years' time, you'll be on stage here instead of me. And you'll be telling these same stories of how you built something up from the ground up. So I want to say thank you. Again, sorry I went a little bit quicker than I thought. I have that QR code right there is a link to a Google form where if you it's just for me, this is just mine. It's my feedback or feedback just to me on my way of talking. Um, it is my honest truth. Please put your honesty there. The only way I can get better as a speaker is to have the unvarnished truth. And I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking to us, JJ. It was a pleasure listening to you. I know it's really late, so we won't keep you up any longer. But the audience, if you have any questions for JJ, please send it to us, organizers, or please you can contact JJ himself. Thanks again. Hopefully, we'll see you next time.
Yes, thank you all again. This was early morning. So sleepy, so tired. All right, bye.